Thank you, Daryl. We thought it was a good idea to give you an update on where we are with the P&C review. And let's see whether I can get it done in 15 minutes. A bit of an overview, outcome so far, next steps, and timeline is the outline for the presentation. When we created the P&C in between November 2004 and November 2005, we then entered into a 2-year period of implementation trials. Simultaneously, we developed the national interpretations for Malaysia, Indonesia, and Papua New Guinea. And so in 2007, we actually went to work with the P&C and the implementation guidance, the generic guidance, and the national interpretations. Now it's 5 years on, and so we have now started the first review of the P&C. We intend to follow ISEAL best practice. ISEAL, as you know, is an umbrella organization that brings a number of eco-labeling and social labeling organizations together. RSPO has applied for full membership of ISEAL, and the ISEAL codes of practice, ISEAL assurance code, and the ISEAL credibility principles, which are under development, are considered to be best practice in the world of standard setting. Decision-making in the P&C Review Task Force is aimed to be done by consensus. First, the Executive Board created a P&C steering group, which consists of the chair of the Standard and Certification Standing Committee, the chair of the Trade and Traceability Standing Committee, an Indonesian grower rep from the Executive Board, a Malaysian grower representative from the board, our Secretary General, and our Technical Director. They have identified the facilitator for the review process, and they have established the P&C Review Task Force. So, here's the P&C Review Task Force. We have 20 members, 8 growers, 4 supply chain and investor representatives, 4 environmental representatives, 4 social representatives, and their tasks, their role is to actively participate in meetings, email exchanges, email discussions, but also, of course, to consult with interested parties. You will see later when we look at the timeline, this seems to be a rather lengthy process, and that is for good reasons. These are difficult discussions, complicated discussions, and the people on the task force are supposed to consult with their respective constituencies. Seeking to build consensus within the task force on how to address any issues that arises. So the process is happening in phases. A pre-consultation in January 2012, and the outcome of that was summarized by the review steering group as the input for phase 2. Phase 2 started in January 2012. We hope to complete that by March 2013. Originally, we had the ambition to have it completed by now, by this round table. We decided that that was too quick, so we extended the process. And we will, following ISEAL best practice, have 2 rounds of public consultation. And the second round of public consultation is actually happening now. So the document is on the RSPO website. Everybody can have a look, and everybody can send comments if they wish to do so. So here is the complete timeline. First public consultation in December 2011. The review task force established in April 2011. I'm thinking the first public consultation can't have been in December 2011. That must have been December 2010. A review of relevant outputs in April, then in May, the first meeting of the review task force. It's January 2011, April 2011, May 2012. Then in June, the second meeting of the review task force, and in August, the third one. ProForest is the facilitator for the process. Out of the consultation and out of the discussions in the task force came proposals for 4 new criteria to be added to existing principles on ethical conduct, on forced and trafficked labor, on human rights, and on carbon emissions. The location in the P&C for the proposed criterion on ethical conduct isn't decided yet, but it will read something like growers and millers commit to ethical conduct in all business operations and transactions. Many companies have adopted a code of business principles, which is basically about ethical conduct, about fair dealings, fair contracts, about avoiding bribes, etc., etc., etc. And it is felt necessary to add this requirement, this criterion to the P&C. And the indicator will read something like there will be a written policy which is implemented and communicated to all levels of the organization. A new criterion is proposed on forced or trafficked labor. No forms of forced or trafficked labor are used, with a number of indicators: no forced, bonded, or trafficked labor. A temporary or migrant workers' labor policy must be in place, must be available, and no contract substitution has occurred. Then there is the proposal to include a criterion on human rights. Growers and millers respect human rights. You probably have heard of the publication of the Ruggie Framework for Human Rights for Business. This is now rising on the international agenda, and so we feel it is timely to add this criterion to the P&C. And the indicator would be like the one on forced and trafficked labor. A policy to respect human rights shall be documented and implemented. And then, of course, there is the discussion around carbon emissions and a carbon criterion. The proposal in the document is now new plantation developments are designed to minimize emissions and maximize sequestration, carbon stock conservation, and emission avoidance. And potential indicators could be areas with potentially significant carbon stock and potential significant sources of emissions shall be identified and estimated using existing processes. The potential significant carbon stocks in the development area shall be identified as part of the high conservation value and soil assessments, so that would become part of criteria 7.2 and 7.3. And then potential significant emission sources, sequestration and/or avoidance options shall be identified as part of the social and environmental impact assessment as described in criterion 7.1. There is no quantification in here yet, which I think some parties will try and push for in the final discussions. And as an indicator, management plans shall identify the planned measures for minimization and/or avoidance of greenhouse gas emissions and maximization of sequestration. So this is being proposed on transparency, high conservation value documentation, a public summary of assessment reports, including extent of certification of associated smallholders, and the principle 2, clarifying the role of free, prior, and informed consent, the extent of a disputed area, if there is a disputed area, recognized customary rights shall be mapped out, and communities are represented through institutions or representatives of their own choosing. On managing impacts, the principle 4, evidence of good agricultural practices for managing soil fertility. And then under principle 5, a comprehensive management plan incorporating a monitoring protocol and adaptive to changes in circumstances shall be implemented to monitor effectiveness of mitigation actions. So it's not just do these best practices, but it is also try and put a monitoring program in place so that you can actually monitor the effectiveness of the mitigations. RTE species is a rare, threatened and endangered species. Where these species of HCV habitats are present or are affected, then appropriate measures need to be put in place. On greenhouse gases, this might appear under a number of different principles. Managing peat soils in the long term will fall under Principle 3. Minimizing peat subsidence should fall under Principle 4, and there will be reference in the guidance to the best practice manuals that the peat working group have presented yesterday. Under Principle 5, which is best management, guidance has been included to indicate that the use of the palm greenhouse gas tool is the preferred way to report emissions. And then there is a principle on new development, new plantings that I just mentioned. This is the agreed timeline as of now. The second public consultation, as I said, is underway. It started on October 1st. It will last till November 30. Then in the week of January 21st, the final task force meeting will hopefully take place. And I say hopefully because we hope that that task force meeting then leads to a consensus document which can then be submitted to the EB in the week of February the 18th. And then we would probably have to organize an extraordinary General Assembly to vote on the revised P&C. We realize that it's a tall order to expect so many of you to show up for an extraordinary General Assembly with only one agenda point really, which would be the revised P&C. At the same time, that is an important milestone in the history of RSPO. But we will look into the possibility of doing voting as much as possible, either by proxy ballots or directly electronically via the web. So remember, the second public consultation is still open. We do hope that you will make use of it, that you will have a look at the document that is currently available for consultation. If you have questions, you can contact ProForest. They're here with a couple of people. And if you have comments, then please, this is the last bullet point on this slide, provide recommendations with actual text changes. You can do that at the RSPO booth and on the computer terminals that are available here. Thank you very much.